As women, I'm sure you know, and it hasn't ended, unfortunately. But we can question the name Renaissance as a term and as a historical delineation. And here is a quotation from Erwin Panofsky about, and some of which, or to some of which I object, because he says that economists and social scientists, political and religious situations, and most particularly natural scientists, don't have much interest, professional interest in the aesthetic aspects of civilization. And maybe that's true with the word professional, but as a ex-practicing natural scientist, I object to saying that I'm not interested. Anyway, he is related to an extremely famous physicist named Wolfgang Panofsky, and a man I actually got to know, and the director of a major laboratory in the United States. So today, what I want to talk about instead is the Renaissance of the 12th century, as it is called, and the development of scholasticism. It's a rebirth of a lot of knowledge in the 12th century, and as I tried to indicate yesterday, much of that increase comes from the rediscovery of Aristotle. Now, for centuries, Christian culture embraced Aristotelian thought as its own, and it probably went from the 11th or 12th century up until roughly the 17th century, and that's a very long time, much longer than science has been in existence. But it withered in the 17th century, the same century in which Aristotle ceased to become an authority for theology as well as natural philosophy, and the demise of Aristotelian thought was not an accident at all. His transformation from ancient sage to impious pagan with dubious dogmatic doctrine was part of the general rejection of old Greek philosophy that accompanied the scientific revolution. But the integration of Aristotelianism into European thought in the 12th and 13th centuries is seriously among the most remarkable movements, I think, in European intellectual history. Again, there's no microphone, so people who come in late don't sit too far back. And if you can't hear me, please raise a hand so I know, okay? Now, the success that Aristotelianism enjoyed for more than 4 centuries is somehow, it obscures the originality of early thinkers and people who interpreted this newly translated works. And in the writings of a long-dead pagan Greek to needs of Christian medieval society. And these needs, as I tried to point out yesterday and will continue, are not just theological, but they are also medical, and they are dialectical, as Aristotle's logic becomes a tool used in all fields that required any sort of learned argument. Now, the term dialectic is a physics term about insulators. Dialectic. Sorry, that's memory coming from years back. The term dialectic has become seriously involved in political discussion due to Marx and Engels, of course, who combined Hegel's idea of dialectic with materialism to develop communist theory. So let me go back to the original definition What it really means is a discussion between two people who have differing opinions and try to settle them, the differing opinions, in a polite and reasonable way. So what Hegel talks about is a thesis and an antithesis, and then putting them together to make a synthesis. Now, this is really, the Greeks would call this the Socratic method, because that's what Socrates did. And Socrates, in turn, apparently got this from Zeno, who is the author of Zeno's Paradoxes. And I don't know, do people still learn Zeno's Paradoxes at school? Okay. Just quickly. If you have a tortoise and a hare, the tortoise starts out and goes 50 meters, let's say. Now, the hare, at some point, is halfway to where the tortoise is. But before it can go farther, the tortoise has moved a little bit. And so it's then halfway to where the tortoise is. But when it gets there, the tortoise has moved a little bit. So it never catches the tortoise because it's always halfway of where the tortoise was. That argument, Zeno's paradox, was not solved from about 400 BCE until Isaac Newton invented the calculus and the idea of a limit. So that was around for it's obviously crazy, but the understanding of it logically is very difficult. And we know about Zeno not because any writings of his exist, but because Aristotle wrote a lot about him in his physics. Now, from the end of the 8th century to about the 11th century, the intellectual leaders in the world were largely Muslim, and it's not too much to say that during those 3 centuries, Arabic language was the main vehicle of culture. The conquest of Spain by the Arabs took place in 711 of the Common Era, when they defeated the Visigoths, who were there originally. Now, that army was controlled by Arabs of the Umayyad Caliphate, but the majority of the fighters were actually Berber and not Arab. And that difficulty between Arab and Berber still exists in modern North Africa. So the Berbers were given the hardest jobs in the war, and they were given the regions of northern Spain, the borders with Christians, to guard, which made them most unhappy. So they revolted, first in Morocco and then in Spain. And the revolt in Spain was put down by a very large Arab army in 741. Even there was great dissension among the troops. And what happened during this struggle is the Berbers basically gave up guarding these positions, and Christians completely occupied them. So here is the map about 1000 of the Common Era, and you can see these are Christian territories. Here is Muslim territories. There is the capital at Cordova, Seville, and wonderful names like Bararia, which is Valencia, and there's Barcelona, was Christian at the time, and there's, of course, France. Now, the Muslims had crossed the Pyrenees and occupied the towns along here, Narbonne, and they got as far as Avignon, which is off here somewhere, and Arles, and probably occupied Marseille. But Pepin, they were driven out by Pepin the Short, who was Charlemagne's father. Pepin's father, in term Charles Martel, had been the man who originally controlled the armies that beat the Arab advance way up at the Battle of Poitiers, or Toul, as it's known sometimes, up about here. And eventually Charlemagne established the Pyrenees over here as the hard border between Arab culture and Christian culture. A longer term, more serious result was a struggle in the Middle East between the Umayyad Caliphate, who were based in Damascus, and they were eventually replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate, who moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad. And that made a big difference. But the Umayyads managed to hold on to Spain for a long time, and that was with the capital in Cordoba, and that was the golden age of Arab culture in Spain. And we'll talk about some of those people. The Abbasids, on the other hand, were very intolerant, and they, unlike the Umayyads, and they forced everyone to either become Muslim, to leave the country, or to die. And amongst the people who left was a 13-year-old boy with his family named Moses Maimonides, who I will talk about. The period under the Umayyads is the golden age of Cordoba. And the first great name of that time is a man known as Al-Zafrai, who is known in Latin as Abu Qasis. He was born early in the 10th century and died about the year roughly 1000. But he was a physician, a pharmacist, a surgeon who did considerable work in obstetrics, was the first person we know of who used animal gut for surgery. I can't imagine surgery in the days before anesthetic. And he also has the earliest known record of hemophilia. His books were highly regarded throughout the Middle Ages. They were translated twice into Hebrew in the 13th century and then into Latin in the 13th and 14th centuries. And they were used as late as 1519, which is 500 years roughly since he wrote them. The greatest first philosopher of Cordoba was a man known as Ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes. And there's still a lovely statue, a really nice statue of him in Cordoba. He was born there in 1125, died in Morocco in 1198. He is the best medieval commentator we have on Aristotle. He was a physician of some note, considerably knowledgeable in astronomy, in biology, and other sciences. He was a judge in Seville, and later chief judge and chief physician in Cordoba. He stayed very close to Aristotle's ideas in science and wrote, in addition to what Aristotle wrote, that motion in a vacuum was impossible. This, of course, we now know obviously not to be true. But Aristotle had a terrible problem with motion, so that, for example, if you have an arrow going through, why does it continue to move? This is the idea that Newton eventually came out of inertia. But what Aristotle says is, as the arrow moves, it pushes the air in front aside a little bit. That air ripples around to the back and pushes it again. And so this happens over time. Crazy, but in astronomy, he basically accepted Ptolemy, but he rejected the idea of epicycles. But he refused to become a serious astronomer because it took so long to make observations and he got bored. In medicine, he considered Galen, with a few exceptions here and there. He had problems understanding breathing, because for Aristotle, breathing is voluntary, and for Galen, it's involuntary. And as we know, if you ever try to hold your breath, it's pretty involuntary. He wrote a major medical treatise called Book of Generalities about Medicine in the 1160s. And this was translated into Latin and gained him a lot of respect and renown in the Christian world. He also wrote treatises on physics and on zoology. In those days, of course, people could be expert in many different areas, unlike today. He was a significant enough figure to get a mention in Dante's Inferno. As a person making serious commentary, but he was down there anyway. But I forget what level he was on. Not too deep. I think he was on the same level as, I forget. I think he was on the second level, which is only considerable pain. Anyway, his most famous works are the Book of Healing, which is a philosophical and scientific encyclopedia, and another book called The Canon of Medicine, which was a, oh, I'm sorry, no, I made a mistake here. Another important Muslim thinker that I want to say that he's not in Spain, but he was lived in Persia, and his name is Ibn Sina, who is known by the Latin name of Avicenna. And he was an extremely important person. He was slightly earlier than Averroes in the 10th and 11th centuries, but a polymath regarded as one of the most significant physicians, astronomers, thinkers, and writers of the Islamic Golden Age. He's really described as the father of early modern medicine. He wrote 450 different works. Around 240 have survived to our day. There are about 150 on philosophy and 40 on medicine. And his most famous works are the Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine, which is an encyclopedia, which was a standard medical textbook and lasted from when he wrote it before the year 1000 up until 1650. So a book that lasted, and he wrote that lasted 650 years, a long time. Besides philosophy and medicine, Avicenna's corpus includes writings on astronomy, alchemy, geography, geology, psychology, Islamic theology, logic, mathematics, physics, and poetry. And this is some great. Right, this is over 1,000 years ago. One of the great delights in doing the research for this series has been to realize how intelligent people were and how interesting they were 1,000 years ago. We don't change very, very quickly. The third of these great people, after those two Arabs, was Moses Maimonides, or Moshe ben Maimon in Hebrew, and known in Jewish philosophy as the Rambam, for the Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. He was born in Cordoba on the 30th of March, 1135. We know that precisely because in Jewish literature, it is written as the 14th of Nisan in the year 4895. He died in Cairo in 1204. Remember, he and his family were forced to leave Cordoba in 1149 when he was just 13. And with the arrival of the Abbasids. So the family left for North Africa, and they wandered around living in various cities, and eventually settling in Cairo in 1165. Maimonides wrote most of his works in exile. After all, he was only 13 when he left. He worked as a physician and was honored for his work by the Muslim Emperor Saladin, and worked in Saladin's court as the court physician. He and Averroes were the two greatest philosophers of their time. Neither of them knew Greek, and so they depended upon Arabic translations of the ancients. A leading figure in medieval Jewish culture, Maimonides was a jurist, a theologian, a philosopher, and a physician. He wrote also significant works on astronomy. His special interest is not primarily original ideas, because he stuck largely to the current Arab thinking of his time, but he is particularly known for a strong emphasis on studying science in medieval Jewish culture. He gave science a great role as a step in the process followed by Jewish people for reaching what he regarded as the highest point of human knowledge, which is the knowledge of God and God's creations. Secondly, though, he stressed that science should be based on solid logical grounds and on demonstration, which is close to Aristotle, and not solely on empirical observations. And this lack of empiricism was very characteristic of thinking in his time, and changed slowly over the next several hundred years as modern science slowly developed. Science, of course, progresses in a cumulative manner through the correction and refinement of data, of empiricism. But Maimonides gave an important stimulus to the development of Jewish science in the Middle Ages and in medieval Europe in particular. In medicine, he wrote short works, a treatment on asthma, an epistle on hemorrhoids, and a book on coitus. He's also the author of A Regimen of Health, a treatise on the causes and symptoms, book on poisons, protection against fatal drugs, and a commentary on the names of drugs. And here are pictures of these two great people from the early 12th centuries, Averroes and Maimonides. I think these have no relation to what they actually look like. He published translations of Galen and Hippocrates, sometimes in Latin, but mostly in Arabic. His work on astronomy is less than his work in medicine, but is more interesting to me, of course. For him, there was a close connection between the knowledge of nature and the structure of celestial spheres and the knowledge of metaphysics, which he regarded as a divine science. Much of his work is contained in this book, the Mishnah Torah. People really decorated books beautifully in those days. Of course, it's all hand copied. But his most famous work, of course, is The Guide of the Perplexed, which was written between 1180 and 1190. He wrote this in a language called Judeo-Arabic, which is basically Arabic with a few Hebrew words, but not many. And so it's basically Arabic, but it's written in the Hebrew alphabet rather than in the Arab alphabet. And so nobody could read it except those few people. And so eventually it was translated into Hebrew so it could be read around the world by people in other places. His discussions of the exact scientists are meant to give answers to religious and philosophical questions. He wrote, the design of this work is promote the true understanding of the real spirit of the law. This is his book. Studied philosophy, embarrassed by the contradictions between the teachings of philosophy and the literal sense of the Torah. The Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar, as is the Arabic, but they are very different in the sense that the solar cycle repeats every 19 years, exactly the same every 19 years. Now, but the lunar calendar and the solar calendar are very different. In the Hebrew calendar, lunar leap months, entire leap months are added 7 times during the 9 years in order to keep things in sync with the solar calendar. But even then, they have to add 3 leap days at some point to get it really back on time. The Arabic calendar and the Islamic calendar, of course, does not do that at all, which is why festivals such as Ramadan move around the various times during the year. being an easy fast during the winter and a very painfully difficult fast during the summer, particularly if you live in Northern Europe, or there are lots of Muslims in Sweden where the sun virtually never sets. You must be very hungry. He spends a lot of time discussing a topic of great importance in his day, a contradiction between Aristotle's concept that all motions in the heavens had to be perfect circles and Ptolemy's idea of epicycles to better describe what really goes on. And if I can get my young man to help me, I have a video I'd like to show you, but I have to figure out how to get it. I've got it on Explore. Oh, it's on Explore. So it should be right here. Yeah, there it is. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now, there are two views. Here is Ptolemy's view, where the Earth is at the center and the sun revolves around it. And here is Copernicus' view, where the sun is at the center. And what I want to do is let you trace the orbits and see which one is more reasonable. All 8 planets are shown up to Neptune. Pluto, of course, is no longer considered a planet. These going backwards is called retrograde motion, where the planet stops in the sky, turns around and moves in the wrong direction, stops again and moves back, as seen from Earth, of course. Whereas in the Copernican model, everything is nice and smooth and easy. So this is a complicated mess. Okay, now I have to. So, thank you very much. One of his most often quoted works is a letter to the sages of Montpellier about astrology, in which he repudiates astrology, as most serious thinkers of his time did, because he could not believe that stars could emanate any non-corporeal force. How can something that's hundreds of millions of kilometers away affect the way you and I behave? And I can, in some sense, understand how people could believe that, because they see what the moon does on the oceans here. Anyway, that's what... one of the commentators on him was Rashi, or the Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who lived in France rather than Spain, and lived in the city of Troyes about 1040. And he was a very serious influence. I will come back to some of this. But I want to come now to France and Aristotle. Yesterday I mentioned the concept of universal ideas, something which is always true. And this was first articulated by Plato and discussed at great length by Aristotle. I like that. I looked for this Latin phrase, which is clearly not Aristotelian, in Greek, which was Aristotle, but I couldn't find it. Universal ideas became an important metaphysical issue in the Middle Ages, especially at the time of Peter Abelard. To put as simply as possible, but I'm really glad that you have this so that you can, if you like, read it at some later point. because it contains a considerable amount of what I have to say. How can we tell that something is true for all members of a given group if we know it to be true for some? And for example, we know the Pythagorean theorem that tells us how right triangles work. Is it true for every conceivable right triangle, however? For everyone? How do we know that it's correct for every possible, more than we can possibly see or even imagine? Is it true for everyone? Here's again a much later picture of Peter Abelard. Now, this discussion is of some medieval physical concepts which have never been satisfactorily resolved, and discussion continues to this day, which means they are not easy. And I hope to be as clear as I can, although it's difficult. Neoplatonic philosophers, pagans, such as Plotinus and Porphyry in the 3rd century, Christians such as Augustine and Boethius in the 5th and 6th centuries, 4th, 5th, and 6th century, they observed an agreement between Plato and Aristotle's approaches, saying that human minds get their concept of universals from experience. Universal concepts and universal features arise by means of obviously universal signs, the common terms of human language. For example, the word human in English is a universal term because it's predictable of all humans in one and the same sense, as opposed to a singular term like Socrates, which only refers to one person. But this is, for example, why we have to put numbers after the names of kings and popes with the same number, like George V and George VI. Universals are a class of mind-independent entities, usually contrasted with individuals, which are called in philosophy particulars. These are postulated to explain relations of qualitative identity and resemblance among individuals. Individuals are said to be similar if they share universals. For example, an apple and a ruby are both red, and their common redness occurs from sharing a universal. But if they are both red at the same time, the universal red must be in two places at the same time. That makes universals very different from individuals and difficult. Whether universals are really required to explain relations of qualitative identity and resemblance among individuals has been a problem that metaphysicians have worried about for about 2,000 years. That makes them hard because and the thing I love about philosophy is there are no definite answers, of course. You can think whatever you want. Now, the disputants in this fall into one of three broad categories. There are realists who believe that universals exist. There are also two categories who don't believe they exist, called conceptualists and nominalists. And they deny that such are needed, but conceptualists say that, and I'll come back to this in several different ways. Conceptual things exist only in the mind. Nominalists believe that any kind of qualitative resemblance is ungrounded, and there have been lots of versions of nominalism, and some that are really terribly sophisticated. These differences arose really in the Middle Ages, and again, to a large extent, with Peter Abelard. So, realists are those who assert the existence of real universals. Conceptualists allow universals as only as concepts of the mind, and nominalists claim that there are only universal words, not universal things. Nearly all medieval thinkers agreed on the existence of universals as things in the mind of God and as divine. But in terms of humans, that was a considerable difference. Their disagreements concerned the types of relationships holding between particular things. Again, realists believing in universally comprehensible features, conceptualists believing only in concepts of the mind, that is, ideas, and nominalists believing only in universal terms of the language. Abelard, in his book Logica Ingredientibus, or the ingredients of logic, says that only universal words can be really regarded as being essential. And this makes him, of course, a nominalist and a very strong one. So he has the following three conditions. What do we mean by the likeness of things? And is a word called common on the common cause things agree in, or account of a common conception, or account of both? He was a very smart guy. Now, these questions open up a whole new area and the problem with universals, because in addition to things, they add a semantic aspect to the concept of universals. So we have to be able to assign a common cause by the recognition of which, in terms of a common concept, we can give a common name to a potential infinity of individuals, like an infinite number of right triangles. Now, the impression of universal words cannot be any one thing, or even a multitude of things, but they are a common cause, so they can't be nothing. Abelard calls this common cause the status of things is a cause, but a cause which is a non-thing. For example, he says, and I love examples because otherwise I don't understand any of this. What he says is, for example, the ship was wrecked because the pilot was absent. The cause that we assign, namely the pilot being absent, is not a thing, it's rather how things were, which in this case we signify by the phrase, the pilot was absent. Abelard says that the common cause of imposition of a universal name has to be something in which things falling under that name agree. I have to read this stuff because I don't always understand it. For example, the name man, in the sense of a human being, not of a male human being, is imposed on all humans on account of something in which all humans agree. But that in which all humans agree is that each one of them is a man. Each one agrees with all the others in their being a man. So it is being human, in Latin, esse hominum. That's the common cause Abelard's looking for, and this is what he calls the status of man. It's not a thing, it's not any singular person, for obviously no singular person is common to everybody, and if we look at a phrase like Socrates is a man, Plato is a man, etc., it is clear that if we abstract from these singular subjects, retain what's common to them all, we get precisely the status in which all these subjects agree, namely being human. So the status constitutes an ontological, a nature of being realm, that's entirely different from ordinary things. Now, of course, it's not possible to mention Peter Abelard without discussing his love affair with the wonderful Eloise and his terrible punishment, which was castration, meted out to him by her uncle Fulbert. Theirs was a deeply passionate love affair, and one which has become idealized in history. It ended, obviously, tragically and awfully. After this, Abelard left the University of Paris and went off to become a monk. Eloise became a nun. This was 1119. They were separated, but they remained faithfully in love until they died. Although she wrote passionate love letters to him, he wrote considerably less passionate love letters back. The collection of their love letters is one of the most popular classics of modern literature. There's a 19th century painting of them. There they are, snogging away, and there's Uncle Fulbert in the background thinking dastardly thoughts. Eloise quoted this about marriage. Now, also, to show you the kinds of passion involved in this, this is the most remarkable comment. She was born in Paris in 1101, which means at the time of their separation, she was 18. I mean, people were somewhat more mature at 18 in those days, but nonetheless, she was a kid. She died in 1164, he died in 1149, and she was buried beside him. In principle, they're buried together in Paris at the Père Lachaise Cemetery, and their tomb is a great visitor attraction. Whether they are really there or not, nobody seems to know, but there they are. And lots of people, including me, leave flowers on that. They're very important. Now, the problem of universals is not just medieval. For example, there's no such thing as a universal book over and above individual copies of a book. This analogy of books shows why this conception is an interesting example of the possibility of universal knowledge. For just as we do not need to read all copies of a book to know that on page 100 there will be certain words if it's not a corrupt copy. However, but what we are doing in that case is reading the singulars, the individual things, and without having to experience every single book. And this reading the singulars is not just a metaphor, because this is what geneticists are doing today in following the human genome project. Whoever would want to deny a recognizable sameness across many singulars would have to deny that you can't recognize the same words or the same letters in the same sentence. And that's, of course, crazy. And because then you couldn't read, speak, or do anything. And that is not something one discusses in philosophy. Now, but there's another problem about the same nature. For example, suppose that edition 1 has 200 pages. And therefore, on page 87, there's the word "and" right in the middle. But then edition 2 is printed on bigger paper and has only 100 pages. Is it the same book? So only in the mind it can be the same book, and it's only under this aspect in the mind that it can be called universal. So, to sum up, I'm trying to distinguish between nature existing in the singular, such as an individual human nature of Socrates, one item, and the universal, such as the species of human nature existing only in the mind in abstraction from individual conditions, and nature according to an absolute consideration, such as human nature considered an abstraction both from its existence in individual subjects and in the mind as an idea. And that's enough of this. This is part of it. Okay, now, many things have changed considerably by the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century. I am trying to go a little bit slower today because, as I said, this is hard stuff. There were still some great scholars in Islam, but they were becoming exceptions. Muslim initiative was being damped by religious obscurantism. In the meanwhile, Jewish and Christian efforts were increasing, and the great endeavors of Islam were filtering into the minds of Jewish and Christian thinkers. There's a decreasing Arab supremacy, but not yet any supremacy to really replace it. But the beginning of the 12th century then is a period of transition. Culture is being transmitted from one group to another. There are a large number of people of importance. I want to start with just three: a Christian, William of Conquest, a Jew, Abraham ben Ezra, and a Muslim, Ibn Zuhir. Abraham ben Ezra has been immortalized by Robert Browning in the following poem, of which I put up a few verses. It's a very long poem. But some of these things are really very nice. Nor be afraid. Life fleets, all has changed. The past gone sees today. All very wise advice. Ibn Zuhir was one of the greatest physicians of the Middle Ages. William of Conquest was one of the most original figures of his era and a teacher of the future Henry II of England. He specifically used the Latin word elementata for air, earth, air, fire, and water, and from him we still use for the fundamental atoms the word elements, and it comes from him at the beginning of the 12th century. Here is a beautiful illustration of the four elements I found in the British Library, where I sit and prepare a lot of these lectures. There's earth, there's air, no, there's air, there's water, that must be fire then. Now, from 1095 to 1204, there were 4 crusades that were, among other things, a revival of Christendom. And a lot of people, those who watch movies anyway, often think of the Crusades as a holy war waged by devout Christians against Islam, often viewed and even taught in schools as a group of crusaders, noble knights, fighting the infidel in the most chivalrous manner, bringing Western civilization to the East. Unfortunately, reality is very different from that. First, the Christian hordes, and hordes is an appropriate term for what was generally a rabble of poorly fed and poorly led troops. They were generally much less civilized than the Saracens whom they were fighting. Chivalry was by far the exception rather than the rule. The First Crusade, which conquered Jerusalem in 1099, was particularly odious because of the slaughter of most of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city, and not fighters, but just ordinary civilians. Their greed and brutality was actually very different from that of the so-called infidels. And who first took Jerusalem in 637, and again by the Muslim reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin, who was not Arab, by the way, he was a Kurd. A very tragic part of this history and a painfully shameful story is that the Crusades, nominally a struggle against Islam, created great opportunities for persecution of other so-called infidels, in particular for the Jews of Europe and the Middle East. the criminal birth of serious anti-Semitism began really with the Crusades. And each of the first three Crusades were accompanied by violent anti-Jewish outbursts in France, Germany, and later in England. Because the Holy Land was so far away and poorly fed and equipped troops lacked the ability to get there, they took out their anti-Muslim fury on the local population, the mostly Jewish population instead. We use the word pogrom, or devastation, which comes from the Russian word gromit, to meaning to destroy. There shortly followed anti-Jewish regulations to perpetrate these injustices, and his hatred warped Christian souls, initiating untold misery and wickedness. It is from this time that calumnies such as the crucifixion of Christian children and the baking of matzahs using the blood of Christian children and other such horrific fantasies began. In the very first crusade in 1096, a man known as Peter the Hermit led what was called a People's Crusade. This had no preparation and little chance of ever reaching the Middle East, but they did manage to cause untold grief for Jewish communities in Germany and along the rest of what route they go. Scholars estimate that about 10,000 Jews in Germany and Northern Europe were killed. That's about 1/3 of the entire population. And that was in the 6 months of the beginning of 1096. It was a time, of course, of considerable spiritual and physical unrest. And this was true both in politically as well as religiously. For example, the story of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Lion of Winter, and the murder of Thomas à Becket. These stories are well known. Not so well known, perhaps, is what historians call the anarchy. This was a full-blown civil war between 1135 and 1153 and took place in England and Normandy. Henry I died in 1135, but his son and heir William had already died in a shipwreck back in 1120. Before he died, he tried to ensure that his daughter, Matilda, would inherit the throne. But the throne was seized by Stephen of Blois, another Frenchman, after Henry I's death, and there was seriously fierce fighting with local barons all over Normandy and Britain. In 1139, Matilda led an invasion army from France, and there was a lot of slaughter but very little progress. In 1148, she retired to Normandy and left the fighting to her son, Henry Fitz-Empress, also known as Henry Courtemantle, from the French court manteau for short jacket, and also known as Henry Plantagenet. And fighting dragged on and on until they agreed in 1153, with Stephen recognizing Henry as his legitimate heir. Stephen died a year later, and Henry II took the throne, and that began the Angevin regime in England, and lots of romantic legends. There was also a period of the creation of new religious orders, because the Benedictines, who had been established back in the 6th century by St. Benedict, were over that 500 years, had become, quote, immoral, unquote, and that is lax. And so there were lots of much more serious religious orders formed. But much of the unrest was caused by the new availability of these Greek works. And such new books depended on translators. And so the largest part of intellectual effort in the Middle Ages was not the creation of new material, but translating Aristotle and Plato. And the work consisted of translating Arabic to Latin, Greek to Latin, Arabic to Hebrew, Hebrew to Latin, Celtic to Latin for tales by Welsh monks, Latin into French. Abelard of Bath, who I mentioned yesterday, translated Al-Khwarizmi's astronomical tables. But his most significant contribution was a translation of all 15 books of Euclid's Elements, which is why students have had to suffer geometry lessons